How's it going, everybody? Noah Hiles, Andrew Destin here with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and we're switching it up. In the last couple of Thursdays, we've talked a little bit of high school sports, a little bit of college sports, some NFL, some gambling. Thursdays, we're gonna have a solid path now, and it's just gonna be college football. You have two college football reporters here. This is the college football show, and you can see it every Thursday here on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette Sports YouTube account. As I said, I'm Noah. He's Andrew. Andrew, how's it going today?
Doing great, Noah. How about yourself, my man?
I can't complain. We've got another week of some matchups. Both of the teams we cover are still ranked. Yours continues to move up. Mine either moves down a spot or stays exactly the same, it seems, every week. But nonetheless, two relevant programs in the state of Pennsylvania. We'll start with yours first because it is number 11 in the country. And Penn State has a Big Ten matchup this week. Second one of the season for them, taking on Northwestern, which, you know, on paper isn't the most exciting. They've got some better ones coming up here soon. But there are, in every matchup, there are some entertaining storylines that pertain to that week of action. Andrew, what's one that stands out for you here as the Nittany Lions look to host Northwestern?
Well, definitely. The one that stands out to me is on the offensive line for Northwestern versus Penn State's pass rush. The Nittany Lions, the first two games, really weren't able to get after the quarterback, had 3 sacks in the first two games, had 9 in the last two, including 7 against Auburn. But now they might face arguably their toughest test, which is interesting to say because you're right. You look on the paper and say Northwestern 1-3. Their only loss was win was to Nebraska. They
didn't even win in America, so like you almost can't count.
Yeah, it happened in Ireland. They didn't win a single game in September, because they had a bye week too. So winless in September to the likes of Duke, Miami of Ohio, Southern Illinois. Definitely not a good non-conference here for Northwestern, but a guy that they do have that everybody, NFL draft experts, all those sorts of people seem to love is the left tackle, Peter Skoronski. And he's a guy that James Franklin spoke at his Wednesday press conference. He was a guy that Penn State recruited and wanted to get, but they were not able to. He ended up going to Northwestern, and he's been impressive to say the least there for Pat Fitzgerald. So I'm really curious to see how he does a good job on that blind side, protecting the quarterback Helinski for Northwestern. That's definitely a matchup to watch because Penn State, the sacks have kind of been across the board. Nobody has really stood out as a dominant guy the way that last year you had maybe with Arnold Ebiketie, or if you go further back in time, people Shaka Toney, the way Micah Parsons did as a linebacker coming off the edge. They haven't had that guy. Their sack leader is denied Dennis Sutton, and he's gotten all of his sacks pretty much in the fourth quarter in garbage time. So it's spread across the board. Manny Diaz loves to send the corner blitzes, safety blitzes, get everybody involved. Really curious to see how that does against this Northwestern offensive line because Skoronski, he seems like the real deal.
I did see that PFF college football, the top 3 pass rushers in the Big Ten, all Penn State guys. Is that correct?
Yeah, you heard correctly. A lot of them showing really good things in the fourth quarter. Dennis Sutton, another one. I mean, he was a 5-star freshman recruit, but he's kind of been limited to some of that more reserve game time. But when he's been in, very impressive. I think it more just comes down to getting these guys' feet wet, getting them more game reps before they're trusted earlier in contests. So who knows? Maybe it's conference play, let the cat out of the bag a little bit and let these guys run wild and, rush full steam ahead. Who knows?
So let's flip over to the other side of the ball now. This isn't necessarily just connected to Penn State's matchup against Northwestern. But as we were talking about before the show, there are these guys connected to programs or these storylines, these buzzwords that are, they're gold for people like you and I, Andrew. That every fan of that team wants to read about that guy, that storyline, maybe that coach. And for Penn State right now, it's the freshman quarterback. It's Drew Aller. And as someone who, I try to follow up, I try to read all of our coverage in our sports section. There's a ton of it, so it gets kind of difficult at times.
Right.
But I mean, I'm familiar. I've been familiar with Aller since he was in high school. I actually have friends who went to the same high school as him, and having gone to college in Ohio, you hear that name bouncing around and how he was like this big recruit, and he's going to Penn State, and you kind of wondered what they were going to do with Clifford still being there, and he continues to, just hang around, get some snaps, some more games than others. And my question to you is, how long is this going to continue? Is this something that they're just going to do in games that they're blowing opponents out in? Or do you think that, come next week when their hardest part of the schedule sets in, when they're on the road against Michigan, and then when they come back home and they play Minnesota and Ohio State in back-to-back weeks, Do we see Drew Aller against those teams as well? Is he a regular part of this offense?
He will be involved in the offense as long as the situation presents itself. And that's a way of me basically saying it's Sean Clifford's job to lose. And the way he keeps seeing game action is if Penn State knocks the socks off these teams. If they go up against Northwestern by 30 points, yeah, you're going to see Aller. But it's really interesting you bring that up because the game plan hasn't necessarily been, hey, let's get up by 30 and then put Aller in. That's how it worked out, in the Ohio game. They put him in the third quarter once it was kind of out of reach, put him in against Central Michigan when it was out of reach. But Franklin has said multiple times, the Ohio game and the Central Michigan game, the plan was to get Aller a series in the second and a series in the third. Didn't work out that way in either game. In the Central Michigan one, I got to believe it's because that one was too close for comfort, right? It was 14-all going in with like 2 minutes to go in the first half. So that one was a little bit too close, but it makes me wonder what that looks like once we enter conference play, because I can't imagine on the road against Purdue that was the plan to get him involved. It worked out that way because of Clifford's cramping, right?
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that, I don't think that Aller plays. So going into this Northwestern one, I think because of the nature of how Northwestern's been on the year, if they play up to how they've played and Penn State plays to their capabilities, this one shouldn't be close. Could be because Fitzgerald being a good coach and, it looks like it might be rain in the forecast, all those sorts of things. But let's say hypothetically it does play out. Penn State goes up by 30. Yeah, Aller plays. But on the road at Michigan, I'd be surprised to see that. I think you finally see the narrative change because you're on the road. If it's a close one-score game, Franklin's going to ride with Clifford. He's going to ride with his guy, and gaining Aller that experience, it's all well and nice when it's at home against Ohio. It's all well and good when you surprisingly beat Auburn by as big of a margin as you do, and that allows you to get in because they weren't expecting, hey, we're going to be up by 30 points and beat Auburn and go on the road in the SEC and be able to play them a lot. So I tend to believe as you get further into the conference slate against teams like Michigan, hosting Ohio State, the whiteout against Minnesota, the only way he gets in, for better or worse, for Penn State is in a blowout, and I don't think it really matters which direction that's in. If they're up by 40 or down by 40, that's when he gets in. But got to believe they kind of go away from the grain of what they've been doing the first 4 weeks.
See, and that surprises me because we've seen this in other college football programs where there's the star freshman behind the veteran quarterback, and they always seem to find, that one package where you can bring that player onto the field. And I think it's safe to say that Aller is a more dynamic playmaker at the quarterback position than Clifford. I think he can do more with his legs, his mobility than Clifford can, right? He's probably the better athlete. So you look at other examples. I mean, we could go way back to Tim Tebow as a freshman where they would kind of work him in along with Chris Leak. And obviously they had a very different style of play between those two. Sure. And Tebow could do things back then that Aller probably can't do as far as physicality, running the football goes. But even something more recent to when Justin Fields was a freshman at Georgia, and they would work him in there with I forget Jake Fromm, where they had two quarterbacks, but you find a way to put playmakers on the field. You mentioned the rain. I would think that that's an ideal time to bring in a Drew Aller, in a kind of like a pistol maybe or a wildcat type set where the quarterback you're probably running the football, but you have obviously the option to throw it, some play action or RPO stuff with your more athletic of your two options under center. Do you think that that's something Penn State has even considered this year?
I gotta say probably not, but it's more because it's not that Aller's not a good runner. He is a good athlete. I think the deal is because he is that bigger guy, the way you would use him would have to be more similar to, I'm not saying these players are similar at all, but it would have to be more like a Tebow or a Cam Newton where you're running them up the gut versus a guy who can bounce it on the outside. And I don't know that Franklin is in the business of hurting his 5-star like that. I'll speak to on where I'm from, Trey Lance a couple of weeks ago, right? Breaks his ankle in that way, draws a lot of attention. I think that's what they're trying to avoid is that. So while he would be able to run, I think Clifford's style of play, he's more prone to tucking the ball and going versus Aller is more of the natural drop back passer. Yeah. When they're both in an open space, they both can certainly use their legs. Aller's probably a better runner up the gut, but Clifford's better at bouncing it to the outside. So it almost is inverse of like the Fields Fromm dynamic because Fromm's play is more similar to Aller's and Fields is more similar to Clifford, albeit, Fields, I think we all would agree, a little bit more talented of an overall football player than Clifford. So I think it's just a different situation, but Your point is a good one of, hey, these guys present different skill sets. Why not try and use them? And Penn State's done that before in the past when they had Tommy Stevens. He was the backup quarterback to Trace McSorley. Old offensive coordinator Joe Moorhead liked getting both those guys in there.
Mm-hmm.
He really did. He called it the line package with Stevens. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibilities to say that Aller plays. The deal is just with the way that their skill sets align, it's kind of reverse of what you would like if you were to be using that, under the younger guy who has that different skill set that is a little bit more mobile. Because I think that's more Clifford's forte is being the balanced player, while Aller's got the rocket arm, the rifle. He can sling it downfield. So if you're bringing him in, it would be maybe for those third and long type of packages, but it's tough to say for certain.
All right. Well, I've interviewed you about Penn State. Why don't you take the lead now and have me talk about some Pitt Panther action? What do you want to know about Pitt this week, Andrew?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind with me is you're playing against a Georgia Tech team that seems like the program's going through the ringer a little bit right now. I'm sure you can expand on that just a little bit more, but no more Jeff Collins. It seems like seems like easy pickings for Pitt this weekend, but maybe you could tell me otherwise.
I mean, I would agree. I think even with Jeff Collins, it probably would be one of the easier games on their schedule. Georgia Tech just really haven't been good lately. And it doesn't matter who their head coach is, but under Collins, I think they went 10-28 or something I saw. Not a lot of success in conference play or outside conference play. And they felt, $11 million was worth it to get him out of there. And it creates an interesting dynamic, though, heading into this one, because Pitt all week long has talked about how forget the past 4 weeks, forget the backyard brawl, forget the overtime loss to Tennessee, forget the 2 grinded out wins we had over Western Michigan and Rhode Island. The season starts now. This is their conference to defend, and they look at Saturday as the real start to their season, and that gives them a lot of motivation. Well, now they have an opponent who has a similar mentality, and they're also coming in looking to prove some people wrong about their head coach being fired. And as a guy, who likes to play the number a little bit here and there, that a very common cliche in the sports gambling community and just the football community in general is never bet against an interim head coach in his first game. And Narduzzi's actually talked about this week at nauseum. He said, it's almost like you're playing a team for the first game of the season, and not to go with the analogy that I just gave, but that with the idea that you don't know what to expect. Are they going to just play it by the book? They still have the same OC. They still have the same DC. But was there things that Collins didn't allow them to do that maybe their interim coach will allow for? Will it be a little bit more tight, or will it be way looser and they'll have more freedom with the playbook? Who knows? And it's tough to predict. Pitt's defense is going to be ran the same way regardless. They're going to bring pressure. They're going to play cover 1 or cover 0. So that kind of takes away the chance to be caught off guard in certain situations simply because you're going to be attacking everything the same way anyway in the grand scheme of things. But overall, it does make things a little bit more interesting in a game that otherwise, would be just kind of looked at as a blowout opportunity.
Right. Yeah, and this Georgia Tech team is so interesting to me because Collins, he was brought in essentially, right, to kind of change the program over in the Paul Johnson era that, hey, we're no longer going to run the ball 95% of the time. And now you look at this Pitt team, and you could kind of make an argument that's a similar grain. It's a little bit different. You're not moving from a
triple option team, yeah.
But it's kind of the inverse, right, in that respect that you had Mark Whipple as the OC last year, highly successful with Kenny Pickett, and it seems like this year kind of gone the other way, and they've done Pat Narduzzi offensive football, but you can certainly expand on that a little bit more than I can.
Well, don't you dare call them a one-dimensional team. Don't you dare call them a run-first team, because I asked that to Narduzzi, to Abanikanda, and to Slovis after Saturday's win, and all of them were adamant in saying that no. This is a very versatile offense. It's a multiple offense. And despite 61% of the play calls through 4 games being runs, they still feel as a team they can move the ball through the air at will. And it's just based upon matchup. And if you look at the film, pretty much every single one of Slovis's passing yards were after the catch against Rhode Island. it was just a lot of, check downs, rollouts, complete it to the flat and let your athletes do stuff. That could be looked at as not being aggressive in play calling. It could also just be looked at as making the right decision. And Keaton actually spoke about that. He said, when I was a freshman at USC, I would be too aggressive. And I would think, oh, I can force this into double coverage and my guy can make a play. And it would result in some interceptions. And having a mature quarterback is being able to recognize that you don't need to do that. You can throw the ball in the flat and get 7 yards, and you have a 2nd down and 3 with a really good running back. And that's kind of been Pitt's forte, especially in these last 2 games, is long drives, kill it in the time of possession, and just grind down the opposing team's defense. And I think part of a reason for that is based upon their injuries. Last week, they had their top pass catcher hurt, and Jared Wayne. Gavin Bartholomew, their starting tight end, stood on the sidelines with his arm in a sling the last 2 quarters of the game. So you're losing those 2 guys. And also, their quarterback was coming back from an injury. They played against Western Michigan with a 4th-string quarterback. They played the second half against Tennessee with their backup, and he played the 4th quarter in that game on one leg. So they really haven't had their offense at full health since the first half against Tennessee. And if you look back at that one, Andrew, they actually were throwing the ball quite a lot. And it was working for the most part until, Keaton took a big hit late in the first half and it kind of switched things up. So maybe it is fair to assume that sometime down the line, this team is going to start throwing the ball more and have success doing it. I don't think that's coming Saturday, though. You look at what Georgia Tech struggles against, it's the run. They average, they allow over 209 yards a game on average on the ground. Not a good combination when you're facing the ACC's leading rusher in Izzy Abanikanda and, some solid running backs behind him. So could be another, similar outlook in Saturday where it's going to be long drives, probably not as big as a blowout as many fans would expect, but an outcome that will never be in doubt based off of the play calling and the way Pitt just grinds out long drives. So that's what I would expect, and that's how it's been.
Yeah, definitely doesn't surprise me. I mean, the Georgia Tech team, just where they're at with Collins, and also you mentioned Slovis, and I want to make this point too, is you mentioned the big hit in the Tennessee game. Think how much different that could have gone if Slovis is still in that one. I mean, I know for Pitt fans probably hearing that, I'm nails on a chalkboard, but seriously, this Tennessee team has shown ever since after beating Florida, which that was a crazy game. I mean, the onside kick. I mean, but seriously, I mean, Tennessee has shown it's a top 10 team. They're right up there with the best of them, at least based on what they've done to this point. Pitt was right there with them, and you can make the argument if Slovis is healthy, maybe should have won that one.
Pitt was the better team in that game. I mean, and that's not, I come at that with no bias. I tell everyone, hey, my paycheck cashes once a week, every week, regardless if Pitt wins or loses. I'm not here repping any blue and gold, but I can honestly say, I mean, Pitt looked like the better football team. Their offense was way better when it was healthy in the first half, and defensively, they were brilliant in that game in the second half. And Hendon Hooker made a fantastic play in overtime to win them that game. And Tennessee deserved to win because they made the play when it was needed. But at full health, Pitt's probably a top 10 team in the country, which Penn State's very close to, which brings me up to our final question here that we can finish off with. I think both of these teams, Andrew, Pitt and Penn State, have a very clear route to the college football playoff. It's debatable on who has the easier one. One team's ranked higher, but has a very tough schedule ahead, where the other team's ranked lower, but doesn't probably play in a contest where it will be an underdog until at least the ACC championship game. So I'll ask you first, who do you think has an easier road, assuming all goes well for them, to the college football playoff, Pitt or Penn State?
I'm going with Pitt, and my answer is predicated on the remainder of the schedule. That's the criteria I'll use. And the issue is, right, we just mentioned it there. If Pitt had beaten Tennessee and was sitting 4-0 right now going into conference play, I mean, feel free to tell me otherwise if you disagree, but I feel like that'd be a slam dunk Pitt.
Yeah,
right?
No, it would be almost their spot to lose at that point. I would think.
Right. You're looking at a conference title. You're looking at an undefeated season. Like, all the stars would have aligned for Pitt, kind of in a way that last year the stars aligned in one sense for Pitt to have a really good year, to make the ACC title game, win it, all that sort of stuff. But I think you still look at it this year. what Penn State has to do in the month of October. And, it starts off with Northwestern on October 1st, and then they get a bye week. Penn State has always struggled coming off bye weeks, and then you have to go a brutal 3-game stretch with at Michigan, home against Minnesota for the whiteout, and then home against Ohio State. Those 3 games, you got to win at least 2 out of the 3, and then you're kind of putting it in the hands of the college football playoff, because let's say the only way that you are able to make the Big Ten title game, in my opinion, the only way you make the Big Ten title game if you win 2 out of those 3 games is if your one loss is to Minnesota, which to me is the most winnable of the games.
Without question.
Right. So let's play hypotheticals. You lose to Michigan, you beat Minnesota, and you beat Penn State if you're you beat Ohio State if you're Penn State. If you win those 2 out of those 3, and Michigan's the unquestioned Big Ten East winner, then Penn State's looking at best an 11-1 season where you didn't win your conference, you didn't win your division,
and you have to pray for Ohio State to beat Michigan, essentially. Exactly. And even then, you're losing that tiebreaker. Yep,
exactly. And Penn State was in kind of a similar spot back in 2016. They lost to Michigan. They got thumped after they lost to Pitt, and they were sitting 2-2. They won their next 8 games, but they needed help, and they still didn't get in because Ohio State with an 11-1 record was perceived as better than Penn State with an 11-2 record, despite Penn State having beaten Ohio State. So the issue to me is that the football playoff where it is right now at 4 teams, it's so subjective to the point that the only true way, and James Franklin has said this, the only way you can really guarantee yourself, or at least give yourself like an unquestionably good path, is by winning your conference title and winning your conference championship game, and at the very least winning a division. It seems really hard for me to say right now, if I'm a betting man, that Penn State runs the table and beats Michigan at their place, beats Minnesota, beats an Ohio State team that with C.J. Stroud at quarterback has looked really good. It's hard for me to say that Penn State's got it. They might have the more direct path by being 4-0 and ranked number 11, but I got to believe if Pitt wins out and goes 12-1, it's going to be a better shot, I tend to think. It might be harder because of the perception of the ACC versus the Big Ten, but if I'm choosing between the two, I tend to think Pitt's got a better shot at going 12-1 than Penn State does at 13-0 or 12-1.
Here's why I'll disagree with you, Andrew. You talked about the best way to get into the college football playoff. And yeah, it's by going undefeated or by winning your conference. And no doubt, you can't take those 2 away. They also seem to really care about big wins. Yeah. The only reason Cincinnati made it in last year, if they were undefeated without their impressive non-conference schedule that they went out of their way to make, if they didn't go and do that, they're not in the playoff, even if they are 11 or 12-0 at the end of the season. Pitt does not have a marquee win. And they're not going to really until the ACC championship game. They're going to be favored in every single game. The only ranked opponent I could see them having is probably North Carolina, because I don't see things getting better for Miami with who's still on their schedule. So, I mean, yeah, Pitt, there's a very, very solid chance that Pitt should be 11-1 heading into that ACC championship game. But how much respect does the committee give Pitt through that time period? When those rankings start coming out, where are they going to put Pitt at first? And will all of those wins over 6-7 win programs be enough for them to be in a position to where a win over a Clemson or a Wake Forest or an NC State, will that be enough to catapult them into a top 4 spot? Or will a 1-win team from the Big 12 or the SEC or the Pac-12 or whoever, they'll probably have the better resume. I really do think that. I mean, if you look at Pitt, you mentioned Pitt last year. If Pitt doesn't lose to Western Michigan, I still don't think they're a playoff team, even with 1 loss, even with that win over Wake Forest. I think they're right on the fringe there with Baylor or, those teams who were just, or with Notre Dame, those teams who were, you're getting a really good bowl game, but they got a really good bowl game last year. I think the only way Pitt really could make it is if Miami stays completely red hot and they beat Miami in a ranked matchup. They need marquee wins, or they need to win by a lot. And by the way this team is winning its games right now, it doesn't seem to care if it wins a lot. They're winning convincingly. If you watch the game, you'll see that there's never really a doubt that Pitt's going to win the way they've been dominating the last 2 games and how I think they'll dominate Saturday. But, I mean, how many college football committee voters are really sitting down and grinding the tape all 60 minutes of it for a team that's not named Clemson, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. They're not doing that for Pitt. Pitt's got to do something to stand out, and I don't think it has an opportunity to until it's too late. Whereas Penn State, like you said, these next 3 games after Northwestern, they can lose one of them. I think the only one they can't lose is Ohio State, because I think that Michigan, even if Michigan beats Penn State, this Michigan team, to me, it's got one more stumble in it. It just does. So, and I think that Ohio State will get its revenge.
Yeah, it's at Ohio State this year.
It's at Ohio State. It's going to look for revenge. So I think Michigan will lose at least twice in the Big Ten. So, we'll go down that route. Let's say they lose on the road at the Big House. They get those home wins over over Minnesota, which in reality, that's not that important of a game because it's on their Minnesota's. They can get their payback against them in the Big Ten championship if Penn State makes it. They got to beat Ohio State. And if they do that, they're in great shape. If they win 2 of those 3 games, they're a top 5 team when that playoff show comes, whenever the first week they do it is. They're right on those 2 spots right outside the top 4, and they're just waiting. They're waiting for Ohio State or Michigan or one of the other schools from another conference to fall. And Penn State will be in a perfect spot to absolutely beat the brakes off of whoever they see in the Big Ten title game. That will be a worse opponent than whoever Pitt sees in the ACC championship. And they will win their conference, and they will get in. So that's why I like Penn State's odds to make the college football playoff. They're closer now. They have more opportunities to prove themselves, and they kind of have a mulligan as long as that loss doesn't come to Ohio State, who I think probably, won't lose more than one time after that loss. So I don't know. I like the Nittany Lions road. Personally, I'm kind of just rooting for our 2 teams to play each other in a bowl game because I think the state of Pennsylvania would explode. But that's just me. Anyway, I don't want to see the state of Pennsylvania explode, but I would like to see the excitement. Andrew, any final thoughts on today's show?
I guess I'll be seeing you at the Orange Bowl then, if all things hold true. That'd be my final thoughts. But
that would be fantastic. We could only dream. But we thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe all button if you haven't already. Follow us on all of our social media platforms and be sure to keep tuning in. We will see you here again next week, every Thursday, the College Football Show here on the Post-Gazette Sports Now YouTube channel.